If someone rang you right now, sounded busy, used your company's own words correctly, and asked you to confirm one small thing, you would help them. That is the attack. The most wanted computer criminal in the world got most of his access that way, not by breaking encryption, by being pleasant on the phone. His name was Kevin Mitnick, arrested by the FBI on the 15th of February 1995 after 2.5 years as a fugitive. He spent nearly 5 years in custody, 8 months of it in solitary, because a court was persuaded he could start a nuclear war by whistling into a phone. In the next half hour, you get the real record. What he did, what he was convicted of, and which famous parts of this story are not true. And why it still matters to you this year. The technique that beat billion-dollar companies in 1992 is the one in your inbox this morning. By the end, you have 4 things to check on your own accounts, and 1 question to ask any caller who wants you to hurry. Kevin David Mitnick was born on the 6th of August 1963 in Van Nuys in the San Fernando Valley, north of Los Angeles. His parents separated when he was 3. He was raised mostly by his mother, Shelley, who worked as a waitress, and he was an only child in a series of apartments. By his own account, he spent a great deal of time alone. That detail is not color. A large part of what he later did is explained by a child who was very good at getting adults to talk to him. The first documented exploit has no computer in it at all. He was 12 years old, and it concerned the Los Angeles bus system. Bus transfers were printed slips punched by the driver with a pattern that encoded the time and route. A transfer was worth a free ride within a window. Mitnick asked a driver in a friendly and curious way where the ticket punches were bought. The driver told him. Children ask questions and adults answer them. He bought a punch at a supply shop. Then he collected blank transfer slips from the rubbish bins at the bus depot, which nobody guarded because they were worthless without a punch. With the punch and the blanks, a 12-year-old rode the whole Los Angeles bus network free for as long as he wanted to. Now look carefully at the structure of that, because he repeated it for the next 20 years against far more serious targets. There was no forced entry. He found the one piece of information the system assumed nobody would think to ask for, and he got it by asking politely. The physical security was fine. The bins were the flaw, and the flaw was that nobody had ever classified an unpunched slip as sensitive. That is the entire discipline of social engineering in one childhood story. Attack the assumption, not the lock, and start with whoever is friendliest. He was also, in his teens, an amateur magician. He has said the appeal was the same. Misdirection, watching what people expect and using the expectation against them. I want to be careful here, because this is where the myth-making starts, and this series does not do myth-making. Being good with people is not a superpower, and it does not make what followed harmless. He committed real crimes, and he was convicted of them in open court, twice. But if you go looking for the brilliant technical exploit at the center of the Kevin Mitnick story, you will not find it, because it mostly is not there. What is there instead is a study of how organizations actually work, which is a far less flattering thing for the rest of us to hear. Every company has a gap between its written rules and its working habits, and the gap exists because the habits are what let people finish their jobs on time. He lived in that gap for 20 years, not by defeating the rules, but by behaving exactly like the colleague everyone quietly helps in order to get through the afternoon. In his teens, he found phone phreaking, the subculture built around exploring and manipulating the telephone network, which in the 1970s was the largest machine on Earth. You need to understand what the phone system was, because people under 40 tend to picture it as dumb wires. It was not. It was a computer network that happened to carry voice. Switching was done by equipment that took instructions as tones sent down the same line as the conversation. Control and content shared one channel, which is the original sin of the design. That meant a person who could produce the right tones at the right moment could give instructions to the network itself. That is what the earlier generation of freaks had discovered. Mitnick's interest went further than free calls. What he wanted, consistently, all his life, was access to the internal systems that ran things, and to know how they worked. He learned the internal jargon of the phone company, department names, form numbers, the way a technician announces himself, the tone of voice of somebody who belongs there. With that vocabulary, he could ring an internal desk, sound like a colleague at another office, and be given passwords, dial-up numbers, and switch access as a matter of routine. This is worth sitting with. He was not defeating a security system. He was passing an identity check that consisted of sounding correct. In 1981, as a teenager, he and friends physically entered a Pacific Bell switching center in Los Angeles and took manuals and access codes. He was caught. Because he was a juvenile, the outcome was probation, and that pattern repeats. Early consequences that were mild enough to teach him that consequences were survivable. There was another early case involving computers at the University of Southern California, which resulted in a period in a juvenile facility. By his early 20s, he had a documented history with law enforcement, a genuine expertise in telecommunications, and no legitimate career built on any of it. And I want to name the thing that made him unusual among his peers, because it is not skill. It was persistence of a kind most people cannot sustain. He would work a target for months, learning names, mapping departments, calling repeatedly in different roles, building a picture of an organization until he knew it better than most of its employees. The security industry now calls that reconnaissance, and it is the phase companies still fail to detect, because none of it is illegal on its own. Nothing in 100 friendly phone calls triggers an alarm. The alarm, if there is one, fires long after the attacker already knows everything. There is one more habit worth naming, because it is the one that separates him from the thousands of teenagers doing similar things in the same years. He kept notes, names, extensions, who reported to whom, which office covered which region, what each internal form was called, and who was authorized to request it. In effect, he built himself an unauthorized copy of the company's own directory, and a directory is what turns a cold call into a plausible internal one. Modern attackers do the same thing, and they do not need to phone anybody to start, because a professional networking profile lists the job title, the department, and the manager for free. That is the uncomfortable continuity. The reconnaissance he spent months on by telephone is now a 5-minute search, and the people it targets have not changed at all. Then in 1987, he pointed all of it at a computer company in Massachusetts, and that is what finally put him in federal prison. Digital Equipment Corporation was, at the time, one of the largest computer manufacturers in the world, and its VMS operating system ran on machines inside universities, laboratories, and governments. Mitnick and an associate, Lenny DeSico, spent much of 1987 and 1988 getting inside DEC's internal network, in particular a development cluster used by the VMS engineering team. What he wanted was the source code. Not to sell it, he has always said, and no prosecutor ever produced evidence otherwise, that he wanted to read it and to find flaws in it. That motive matters legally less than people think, and matters enormously for understanding him. There is no evidence across his entire career that he sold what he took or used it for financial fraud. The intrusion ran for months. DEC security people knew somebody was inside and could not identify or exclude him, and the cost of the response ran to a very large figure. It ended the way a lot of these cases end. It was not a technical trace that caught him, it was his partner. Mitnick had been playing pranks on DeSico, including interfering with his payroll records at the company where DeSico worked. DeSico, furious, told his employer, and his employer called DEC and the FBI. He was arrested in December 1988, and what happened at that hearing set the shape of everything afterwards. At the bail hearing, the prosecution argued that Mitnick was so dangerous that no ordinary release conditions were adequate, and the court agreed to extraordinary restrictions. The claim that circulated, and that the judge appears to have taken seriously, was that he could dial into a computer at a military installation by whistling tones into a telephone handset. That is not a real capability. It never was. It is a garbled fusion of 1970s phone phreaking, where a whistle could produce a switching tone with completely unrelated fears about defense systems. But the story worked He was convicted in 1988 and sentenced to 12 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, and part of the time was served in solitary confinement. The court also ordered treatment for what was described as a compulsion, and he attended a program modeled on 12-step addiction treatment. Understand what the state had just decided. Not that he was a thief to be sentenced, but that he was a uniquely dangerous person whose access to a telephone was itself a threat. He came out in 1990, worked for a time at a private investigation firm and a law firm, and stayed within the terms of his supervised release for around 2 years. It is worth pausing on those 2 years because they are the only stretch of his adult life in which he had a lawful job and a lawful future available to him. By every account, he was competent at the work and his employers had no complaints. Whatever drove him back was not poverty, and it was not obviously money at all. He described it later as compulsion, and the court had already described it that way. Whether that framing is generous or accurate is something you can decide for yourself. What is not in question is that the supervised release conditions attached to a man like that were exactly the conditions he was least equipped to keep. Then, in 1992, the FBI came looking for him again over a suspected violation, and Kevin Mitnick made the decision that turned a criminal record into a legend. He ran. In late 1992, he disappeared, and he stayed gone for 2.5 years while a federal fugitive warrant sat on file. This is the part of his life that gets filmed, so let me strip out the cinema and tell you what fugitive life actually consisted of. He rented ordinary flats in ordinary cities. Denver, Seattle, eventually Raleigh, North Carolina. He held ordinary jobs under other people's names, including work in a hospital and at a law firm. The identities were built the same way as everything else: obtain the personal details of a real person, apply for the documents that follow from those details, and let each document validate the next. He specifically looked for the identities of people who had died as infants, because a birth record with no corresponding employment or credit history raises no contradictions. Meanwhile, he did not stop. Across those years, he took source code and proprietary software from a series of technology companies, and the list is long. Motorola, Nokia, Fujitsu, Sun Microsystems, Novell. Cellular handset firmware was a particular interest because a phone whose firmware you control is a phone that can lie about its identity. And the method, over and over, was the phone call. Ring the engineering department, be a colleague from another site with a deadline, ask them to send the code to a machine you control. I have to be plain about the harm here, because it is easy to romanticize a man who never emptied a bank account. The company spent enormous sums on response and remediation, and the intrusion was real. He also monitored the people hunting him. He had access into telephone company systems so he could see which numbers were subject to law enforcement traces. That is the genuinely remarkable part of the fugitive years. He was inside the switching systems that the investigation was using, watching the investigation move. It also explains why he was so hard to find. The FBI would locate a cellular signal, and by the time agents arrived, the flat would be empty and the lease in another name. Now, none of this was public in any detail. A fugitive is a file, not a story. What turned Kevin Mitnick into a household name was a newspaper. On the 4th of July, 1994, the New York Times ran a front-page article about him by the reporter John Markoff. A front page in that newspaper with a photograph converted an unresolved federal case into a national manhunt with a face attached. The article and the coverage that followed described him in terms far beyond what the eventual charges supported, and those descriptions became the public record in most people's heads. There is a long-running argument about that coverage, and I will give you both sides rather than pick one for you. Mitnick and his supporters held that the reporting was inflated, that it described capabilities he did not have, and that it made a fair proceeding much harder to obtain. Markoff has maintained that he reported what investigators and victims told him at the time, which was the standard practice of the era for a story of that kind. What is documented is the effect. Once a description exists on a front page, every later official document is read against it, including by judges deciding whether a man can be released. And that is the moment the story stops being about a man and starts being about a myth, which is exactly when the myth started making the case harder to see clearly. So let us do the part almost nobody does and separate what he was accused of in public from what he was convicted of in court. He was never charged with, and there is no evidence he ever attempted, breaking into systems belonging to the North American Aerospace Defense Command. That claim traces to a film plot and to loose reporting, not to a case file. He did not, at any point, drain money from bank accounts. There is no theft of funds in his record, which is unusual for someone described for years as one of the most dangerous criminals in America. He did not use the source code he took to build a product or sell it to a competitor. Investigators looked hard for a commercial motive and did not produce one. The damage figures reported in the press ran to hundreds of millions of dollars. Those numbers came largely from companies stating the internal value of source code in a period when there was no settled way to value it for a criminal case. What he did do, and what he ultimately admitted, is serious enough without any of the exaggeration. He repeatedly obtained unauthorized access to private systems and took what was inside them. He intercepted communications. He obtained passwords and proprietary code by deceiving employees. He used false identities. He violated the conditions of a court-ordered release and then fled. That is a real list. My point is not that he was harmless. It is that a country cannot correctly punish what it has decided to describe inaccurately. And there was a counter-movement, which is one of the reasons anyone outside computing knows this name at all. Supporters, initially from hacker publications and bulletin boards, started a campaign under the slogan, "Free Kevin." Stickers, a magazine, later a website, and demonstrations outside courthouses. Their argument was narrow and, on its own terms, strong. Whatever he had done, he was being held for years before trial under conditions harsher than people convicted of violent offenses. They also argued that he had been denied normal access to the evidence against him because much of it was digital and the court would not simply let him use a computer to review it. Meanwhile, a separate thing was happening in San Diego that had nothing to do with courts or campaigns, and it is what finally ended the manhunt. Before we go there, one more piece of context that the films leave out because it changes how you read the ending. By late 1994, the technical world was changing underneath him, the internet was becoming a public thing, and the telephone network he had mastered was no longer where the interesting systems lived. A man whose expertise was the switching network of the 1980s was, by 1995, a specialist in a disappearing world. He picked, on Christmas Day, 1994, the single worst possible target in the United States. Tsutomu Shimomura was a computational physicist at the San Diego Supercomputer Center and one of the best-known computer security researchers in the country. On the 25th of December, 1994, someone broke into Shimomura's home computers while he was away and copied a large volume of files, including his security tools. The intrusion used a technique that had been described in academic literature but almost never seen used in the wild, and it is worth explaining because it tells you what the internet used to assume. Two machines that trust each other can be configured so that one accepts commands from the other without a password on the basis of the address the connection appears to come from. An address, though, is just a number written in the packet. You can write any number you like. The problem is that the replies then go to the real owner of that address, not to you. So the attack has two halves. First, silence the machine whose identity you are stealing by flooding it with connection requests so it cannot respond. Second, and this is the difficult part, guess the sequence numbers. Every connection begins with an exchange of numbers used to keep packets in order, and one of those numbers is chosen by the machine you are attacking. You never see it, because the reply went to the silenced machine. So you must predict it. And on the systems of that era, those numbers were generated in a way that was predictable if you sampled enough of them first. That is what happened on Christmas Day, sampling connections, calculating the pattern, then a forged conversation in which the attacker spoke and guessed correctly what was being said back. It is genuinely clever work, and it is the one place in this whole story where the technical reputation is deserved. It is also, notably, not the kind of thing Mitnick was known for. He has said in later years that he did it, and he has also said the credit for the underlying method belongs elsewhere. Both statements can be accurate. The technique was published. Using it against that target was the decision. Because Shimomura did not report it and move on. He treated it as a personal matter, and he had the skills, the equipment, and the contacts to do something about it. He worked with staff at the Well, an online service in California where some of the stolen files had been stashed, and with engineers at internet providers, and they began watching for the intruder's traffic. The trail led through a series of hops to a dial-up account and then the cellular data traffic in the area of Raleigh, North Carolina. The last step was physical. In the middle of February 1995, Shimomura went to Raleigh with technicians and drove the area with cellular direction, finding equipment. The signal narrowed to an apartment complex called Players Court. Direction finding does not give you a name. It gives you a doorway. On the 15th of February 1995, FBI agents knocked on the door of that apartment and arrested Kevin Mitnick. He was 31 years old. The Department of Justice announcement that followed described him as a fugitive computer hacker arrested in North Carolina, and by the next morning it was front-page news around the world. Shimomura and the reporter John Markoff went on to write a book about the pursuit, published in 1996, and it was later made into a film. So the man who caught him also wrote the popular account of the chase, alongside the reporter whose front page had already defined the published version of the fugitive. I am not suggesting anything improper in that. I'm pointing out that for roughly a decade, the only widely available telling of this story came from the people on one side of it. And what happened next is the part of the case that people who work in law still argue about. He was held without bail, not for weeks. He remained in custody pre-trial for years, and during that period spent roughly 8 months in solitary confinement. The justification offered for the solitary confinement was the same claim that had followed him since 1988, that access to a telephone was itself dangerous in his hands. Take a breath and consider that. A man was held in isolation because a court believed a phone call from him could do catastrophic harm, on the basis of a capability that did not exist. His lawyers also fought a long argument about the evidence. Much of the case consisted of files and logs, and the defense wanted him to be able to review them himself, being the only person on his side who could read them fluently. The disputes over what he could be given, in what form, and on what equipment, dragged the case out repeatedly, and every delay extended the detention. Outside, the Free Kevin campaign grew through exactly the medium the case was about. The web made a coordinated international protest cheat for the first time, and this was one of the first causes to use it that way. The prosecution, meanwhile, was facing its own problem. The public numbers were enormous, and the provable losses were not the same thing at all. In March 1999, a plea agreement was reached in the United States District Court for the Central District of California. He admitted 4 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of computer fraud, and 1 count of intercepting a wire communication. The sentence was 3 years and 10 months, with 3 years of supervised release. 3 years and 10 months is 46 months. He had already been in custody for the great majority of that, which is why he was released within months of sentencing, on the 21st of January 2000. Add the earlier case and the pre-trial detention together, and he served around 5 years in total for what he actually did. The restitution ordered was $4,125. Read that against the hundreds of millions reported in the press for years, because the gap is the story. Then came the condition that is genuinely remarkable. For 3 years after release, he was barred from using a computer, a mobile phone, or any internet-connected device without written permission from his probation officer. He challenged parts of it. There was a period where he could not legally hold a job in the only field he knew, could not use a mobile phone, and needed permission to touch a keyboard. He made a living for a while by speaking and writing, which was permitted, and he testified before a committee of the United States Senate about security failures in government systems. Whatever you conclude about the man, the case did leave a mark on American law and practice, and it is a mark worth knowing about. Courts and prosecutors had to work out how to value stolen information, how to handle digital evidence a defendant cannot read without a machine, And how long is too long to hold someone before trial? None of those questions were settled by his case, but it was one of the first where they all appeared at once in public with the answers visibly improvised. The restrictions expired in January 2003, and what he did with the following 20 years is the part I most want you to take seriously. He became a legitimate security consultant, and the company he founded, Mitnick Security Consulting, was hired to attack its clients on purpose and report how it got in. That work has a name now, penetration testing, and a large and respectable industry around it. He was one of the people who made the profession look normal. He wrote books. The Art of Deception, published in 2002, is essentially a field manual for exactly what he used to do, written from the defender's side. The argument in it is one that the security industry now accepts completely and did not accept then, that the reliable way into an organization is a person, not a machine. He later became Chief Hacking Officer at KnowBe4, a company that trains employees to recognize the exact manipulation he had spent his youth perfecting, and he was a part owner of it. There is a legitimate criticism of that arc, and I will state it rather than hide it. He built a career on notoriety that came partly from crimes committed against people who did not consent to being part of anyone's story. There is also a legitimate defense, which is that his knowledge was real, the defensive work was real, and thousands of organizations are harder to breach because of what he taught them. Kevin Mitnick died on the 16th of July, 2023 of pancreatic cancer. He was 59 years old and his wife was pregnant with their first child. And here's why an obituary from 2023 belongs in a series about people who were hunted and caught. Everything technical in this story is dead. The phone switches he manipulated are gone. The sequence number weakness he exploited was fixed decades ago. The human method is not dead. It is thriving. And it is the single largest cause of successful attacks on ordinary people and companies today. The message that appears to come from your bank, your delivery company, your own manager. Urgency, authority, a small reasonable request. That is a 12-year-old with a bus punch, industrialized. What changed is scale. He had to make each call himself and be personally convincing. The same script now runs against millions of people at once, and increasingly, it does not need a human at all. So take the practical part with you, because this is the bit that saves you real money. 4 things you can do this week, and they are all free. 1. Turn on 2-factor authentication on your email account before anything else. Not your bank first, your email, because every other account you own can be reset through it. 2. Prefer an authenticator app or a hardware key over text message codes. Mitnick's whole world was the phone network, and the modern version of that is a criminal persuading your mobile operator to move your number to their device. 3. Adopt one rule for inbound contact. If someone contacts you and asks you to act, you end that contact and reach the organization yourself using a number or address you already had. That single habit defeats almost every version of this attack, because the attacker's entire advantage is being the one who chose the channel. 4. Assume urgency as a weapon. Every social engineering script in history includes a reason you must act now, because hurry is what stops you checking. And the one question to ask any caller who wants you to hurry, I will call you back on the number I already have for your company. If that answer causes a problem, you have your answer. Kevin Mitnick spent 5 years in custody, some of it in isolation, largely for proving that people will help a stranger who sounds like they belong. He was not a genius who broke the world's encryption. He was a persistent man with a telephone and a good manner, and that turned out to be enough against nearly everyone he tried it on. That is the uncomfortable lesson, and it is why the defense is behavioral rather than technical. No software update will fix the fact that we are all polite to a confident voice. Next Thursday on Unmasked, we go to a man who did not talk his way into anything. He built a marketplace that ran on the anonymous internet, believed the maths would protect him, and was undone by an old post and a public library. Ross Ulbricht and the Fall of Silk Road. If this was useful, the first episode of Unmasked on the teenager behind the 2020 Twitter hack is on the channel. Thank you for staying to the end.